Did you see what she's wearing?
Don't worry about her, ladies. She's nobody. Let's get another drink.
The black woman in the simple navy dress sat completely alone at table 17 in the far corner of the Biltmore Ballroom in Atlanta, Georgia, surrounded by empty chairs, while 300 wedding guests in designer gowns and expensive suits filled every other table in the extravagant space. And the whispers had started the moment she walked in. Whispers about who she was and why she was here and whether someone had made a terrible mistake with the seating arrangements. Because this was the wedding of Christopher Ashford Hamilton III, heir to the Hamilton Properties empire, marrying Victoria Elizabeth Pemberton, daughter of federal Judge Richard Pemberton. And this was a gathering of Atlanta's elite, old money and new money and political power. And the woman sitting alone with her hands folded in her lap and her natural gray-streaked hair pulled back in a modest bun was clearly, obviously, painfully out of place. The whispers turned to barely concealed stares as the cocktail hour progressed, and a group of women in Chanel and Dior actually laughed behind their hands while looking in her direction. And one groomsman, drunk on expensive bourbon, loudly asked the wedding planner how that woman had gotten past security. And through it all, Diane Foster sat with her back straight and her dark brown eyes fixed on some distant point, absorbing every slight and every sneer with a dignity that somehow made her seem more regal than everyone else in the room, even though her dress probably cost less than the centerpieces, and her shoes were practical flats from a department store clearance rack. And she wore no jewelry except a simple silver chain with a small locket that she touched occasionally like a talisman. The ceremony had been beautiful, held in the historic cathedral with soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that painted rainbow light across the marble floors. And Diane had sat in the very last pew on the bride's side because there was no room anywhere else, or at least that's what the usher had told her with a dismissive glance that made it clear he thought she was in the wrong place entirely. Possibly a confused guest from another wedding, or perhaps someone who had wandered in off the street seeking shelter from the November cold. She had watched Christopher stand at the altar in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, watched him turn to see Victoria walking down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars, watched him smile with joy and love and promise. And Diane's eyes had filled with tears, but no one noticed because no one was looking at her. No one knew that she was crying not just because weddings are emotional, but because she was watching a miracle that she had made possible. A life that existed because of a choice she had made 28 years ago that had cost her everything, and given her nothing except the knowledge that she had done the right thing even when it was the hardest thing. Now, at the reception, as waiters in crisp white jackets moved through the ballroom serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres that Diane couldn't pronounce, she sat at her isolated table and tried to make herself invisible, tried to ignore the way people looked at her like she was a stain on an otherwise perfect event, tried not to feel the weight of being the only black face in a sea of white privilege, tried not to remember all the reasons she almost hadn't come to this wedding, even though the invitation had arrived at her small apartment in the West End 6 weeks ago with her name written in beautiful calligraphy on the heavy cream-colored cardstock. The invitation had shocked her, had made her hands shake as she held it, because she had never expected this, had never imagined that Christopher even knew she existed, had assumed that the story she had been told 28 years ago was the truth, that her involvement would remain secret forever, that she would live out her days knowing she had changed a life but never being acknowledged for it, never being thanked, never being seen. But the invitation had been real and specific, addressed to Ms. Diane Foster with her correct address, and inside, along with the formal wedding announcement, had been a handwritten note on personal stationery that said simply, "Ms. Foster, your presence at my wedding would mean more to me than you can possibly know. Please come. I have something important to say to you. With deepest gratitude, Christopher Hamilton." She had read that note 100 times, analyzing every word, wondering what it meant, wondering if this was some kind of cruel joke or mistake, wondering if she dared to hope that maybe, finally, after nearly 3 decades, the truth would be told and her sacrifice would be recognized. She had almost decided not to come, had stood in her apartment on the morning of the wedding with the navy dress laid out on her bed, the only dress nice enough for such an occasion, purchased specifically for this day with money she really couldn't spare from her salary as a home health aide, and she had thought about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways she could be humiliated or rejected or dismissed. But then she had looked at the locket around her neck, had opened it to see the tiny photograph inside, and she had known she had to go, had to see him one more time, had to bear witness to the beautiful life that had bloomed from the ashes of her own dreams. The reception moved into dinner service, and Diane watched as waiters placed plates of herb-crusted lamb and truffle risotto in front of the guests at the surrounding tables, watched as wine flowed and laughter echoed and toasts began. But no waiter came to her table, and she wondered if this was an oversight or a deliberate exclusion, and she felt her face grow hot with embarrassment as she sat there with empty space in front of her while everyone else ate and drank and celebrated. A woman at the nearest table, dripping in diamonds and disdain, actually turned around and stared at Diane with undisguised curiosity before whispering something to her companion that made them both laugh. And Diane wanted to disappear, wanted to leave, wanted to spare herself this humiliation, but she stayed because Christopher had asked her to come, had said he had something important to say, and she owed him nothing, but she owed the memory of that day 28 years ago everything. So she sat and endured. Finally, a young waiter noticed her sitting alone with no food, and he approached with confusion on his face, clearly wondering how this table had been missed, and he asked politely if she had dietary restrictions or if there was a problem with her meal. And Diane quietly explained that no one had brought her any food, and the waiter's face flushed with embarrassment, and he hurried away and returned moments later with a plate and a glass of wine and profuse apologies. And Diane thanked him with a grace that made him pause and really look at her for the first time, and something in her eyes, some depth of character and dignity, made him feel ashamed of whatever assumptions he had made when he first saw her sitting alone in her simple dress at this table of empty chairs. She ate slowly, barely tasting the expensive food, her stomach tight with nerves and anticipation, and she kept glancing at the head table where Christopher sat with Victoria, looking like a prince and princess from a fairy tale, and she wondered when he would make his announcement, or if he would, or if she had misunderstood the note entirely. The toasts began after dinner. The best man stood and told charming stories about Christopher's college days at Princeton. The maid of honor cried while talking about Victoria's kindness and beauty, and parents from both sides gave speeches about legacy and family and the bright future ahead for this golden couple. And with each toast, Diane felt more invisible, more like a ghost, haunting a celebration she had no right to attend. And she started to gather her small purse, started to think about slipping out quietly before dessert, before anyone else could make her feel small or unwelcome, before whatever hope she had carried into this ballroom could be completely extinguished. But then Christopher stood up, and the room fell silent, and he tapped his champagne glass to get everyone's attention even though he already had it. And he smiled at his bride and then looked out at the sea of faces, and his expression shifted into something more serious, more emotional, and he said words that made Diane's heart stop. Before we continue with this beautiful celebration, there's someone here tonight who I need to acknowledge, someone without whom I would not be standing here, would not be alive to marry the woman of my dreams, would not exist in any meaningful way, and most of you don't know her. And until recently I didn't know her either, but I know her now. And I need all of you to know her too. Christopher's voice carried across the silent ballroom, and people started looking around, trying to figure out who he was talking about. And Diane felt frozen in her chair, felt every eye in the room starting to search the space. And then Christopher raised his hand and pointed directly at her, directly at table 17 in the far corner, and he said her name. Ms. Diane Foster, would you please stand up? The ballroom erupted in confused murmurs, 300 heads turning in unison to stare at the black woman in the simple navy dress sitting alone in the corner. And Diane felt paralyzed, felt like her legs wouldn't work, felt like this couldn't be happening. But Christopher was walking away from the head table, was walking across the ballroom toward her with purpose and emotion clear on his face. And the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. And Diane finally, shakily, stood up. And Christopher came to stand in front of her, and he took both of her hands in his, and there were tears in his eyes, and the entire ballroom was holding its breath. 28 years ago, before I was born, my biological mother was a 16-year-old girl from a wealthy Atlanta family who made a mistake, and her parents were furious, and they wanted to make the problem disappear quietly, and they found a doctor who would perform a late-term abortion, even though it was barely legal and definitely dangerous. And my biological mother was scared and alone and didn't know what to do. And she went to that clinic on a cold January morning, prepared to end her pregnancy because that's what her parents demanded, and that's what everyone told her was the best solution for everyone involved. Christopher's voice shook as he spoke, and the ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in glasses, and Diane's tears were flowing freely now, and she squeezed Christopher's hands because she knew this story, had lived this story, had been forever changed by this story. But there was a nurse at that clinic, a young black woman who was working there to pay for her own nursing school degree, and she saw my biological mother crying in the waiting room, and something made her stop and talk to this scared pregnant teenager, and they talked for 20 minutes, and that nurse, that beautiful, compassionate woman, told my biological mother that there were other options, that if she couldn't keep the baby herself, there were people desperate to adopt, that this life inside her was precious and deserved a chance. And my biological mother listened, and she started to waver, started to think maybe there was another way. Christopher paused, his voice breaking, and Victoria had come to stand beside him, tears streaming down her face, and half the wedding guests were crying now too, and the other half were staring at Diane with new understanding, with shock, with dawning recognition of who she was and what she had done. But my biological mother's parents found out that she was hesitating, found out that some nurse had interfered, and they were powerful people, and they made phone calls, and within 24 hours, that nurse, Ms. Diane Foster, was fired from her job at the clinic, and not just fired but blacklisted, her reputation destroyed by lies about unprofessional conduct and violation of patient privacy. Lies told by people with money and influence who wanted to silence her and punish her for daring to interfere with their plans. Christopher turned to look at the assembled guests, many of whom were exactly the kind of powerful people he was describing, and his voice grew stronger, harder. Ms. Foster lost her job, lost her career before it even began, was unable to get another position in healthcare anywhere in Atlanta, lost her apartment because she couldn't pay rent, lost her chance to finish nursing school, and all because she took 20 minutes to show compassion to a scared teenage girl and suggest that life was precious. The ballroom was completely silent now except for the sound of crying, and Diane was shaking, was overwhelmed by hearing her story told out loud for the first time in 28 years, was shocked that Christopher knew these details, was terrified and grateful and heartbroken all at once. Christopher turned back to her, still holding her hands, and he continued, "My biological mother left that clinic without having the abortion, and she hid her pregnancy from her parents for another month. And when they finally discovered that she was still pregnant, they were furious. But by then it was too late for any doctor to perform the procedure. And so they did the next best thing from their perspective. They sent her away to a private facility in North Carolina where she could have the baby in secret and give it up for adoption. And 7 months later, I was born, and I was placed with my parents, James and Catherine Hamilton, who are the most wonderful people in the world and who loved me from the moment they saw me." Christopher's adoptive parents stood up from their table near the front, both of them crying, his mother with her hand over her heart, his father with his arm around his wife, and they nodded to Diane with expressions of profound gratitude. Christopher continued, his voice thick with emotion. I grew up in a beautiful home with parents who gave me every advantage, who loved me unconditionally, who supported every dream and ambition, and I had a perfect childhood and a perfect life. And I never knew I was adopted until 6 months ago when my biological mother, who is now in her 40s and married with children of her own, reached out to me through a private investigator because she wanted me to know the truth about my birth. Wanted me to know about the woman who had saved my life. Wanted me to know about Ms. Diane Foster. The revelation hung in the air, and Christopher released one of Diane's hands to wipe his eyes, and then he continued. My biological mother told me everything. Ing told me about that day at the clinic, told me about the kind nurse who talked to her and gave her hope, told me about how her parents destroyed that nurse's life as revenge. And she gave me Ms. Foster's name and last known address, and she begged me to find her, to thank her, to let her know that her sacrifice meant something, that it produced a life, my life. And she said that not a day has gone by in 28 years when she hasn't thought about the woman who saved her baby. The woman who lost everything so that I could have everything. Christopher turned to address the whole ballroom again, his voice rising with passion and conviction. So I hired investigators, and I found Miss Foster living in a small apartment in West End, working as a home health aide because that's the only healthcare work she could get after being blacklisted, making barely enough to survive, no husband, no children of her own because she spent her 20s trying to rebuild from nothing, and by the time she was stable enough to think about her own family it felt too late. And I found this woman who saved my life, who sacrificed her dreams so that I could live mine, and she was alone and struggling and forgotten. And nobody knew her name. Nobody knew what she had done. Nobody had ever thanked her or acknowledged her or told her that she mattered. The weight of his words crashed over the ballroom like a wave, and several guests gasped audibly, and the woman in diamonds who had laughed at Diane earlier was now sobbing into her napkin, and the drunk groomsman who had questioned Diane's presence looked like he wanted to sink through the floor, and every single person in that room was looking at Diane Foster with new eyes, seeing not an out-of-place stranger but a hero, a saint, a woman who had given up everything and asked for nothing in return. Christopher's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but in the absolute silence it carried perfectly. I invited Miss Foster to my wedding because I wanted her to see what her sacrifice created. I wanted her to witness the life she saved. I wanted her to be part of the happiest day of my life because without her there would be no life. No happiness, no me. And I wanted all of you to know her name, to know her story. To understand that the most important person in this entire ballroom is not me or my beautiful bride or my wonderful parents or any of the distinguished guests. It's the woman sitting alone in the corner in a department store dress, because she is the reason any of this exists. Christopher pulled Diane into an embrace, and she sobbed into his shoulder, 28 years of pain and sacrifice and loneliness pouring out of her, and the entire ballroom rose to their feet and began to applaud, and the applause grew louder and louder until it was thunderous, until it shook the chandeliers, and people were not just clapping but crying, not just standing but cheering. And Diane looked up through her tears at 300 people who minutes ago had judged her and dismissed her and now were honoring her. And it was overwhelming and healing, and more than she had ever imagined. Victoria came forward and embraced Diane, whispering, "Thank you for my husband, thank you for our future." And Christopher's adoptive parents came and took turns hugging her and thanking her through their tears. And then something happened that no one expected. The guests began to form a line, and one by one they came to Diane, these powerful, wealthy people in their designer clothes and their privilege, and they apologized for their assumptions and their judgment. And they thanked her for her courage and her sacrifice, and they treated her like the queen she had always been, but no one had recognized. But the moment that broke Diane completely was when Christopher stepped back and said, "Ms. Foster, I need to tell you something else, something I've been planning for months." And he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, and his voice was gentle but firm. "You gave up your career in healthcare because of me. You lost your chance at the life you dreamed of because you chose to save mine. And while nothing can give you back those 28 years, I want to try to make things right. I've established a foundation in your name, the Diane Foster Foundation for Healthcare Advocacy, with an initial endowment of $5 million dedicated to protecting healthcare workers who face retaliation for putting patients first. And I've also created a full scholarship fund at Emory University's nursing school in your name, and I'm funding it with another $2 million. And every year we'll send deserving students through nursing school completely free, and they'll graduate knowing about you, knowing about the woman who sacrificed her career because she believed life was precious." The ballroom erupted again, but Christopher held up his hand because he wasn't finished. "And Ms. Foster, I've paid off why. Our apartment, it's yours now, free and clear. And I've set up a trust fund for you that will pay you $100,000 a year for the rest of your life, so you never have to work another day unless you want to. And if you do want to work, I've spoken with the director of Emory Hospital, and they would be honored to offer you a position in their patient advocacy department, where your life experience and your compassion would be invaluable. And it comes with full benefits and a salary of $85,000 if you're interested. And I know that none of this, none of the money or the foundation or the recognition, none of it can undo what was done to you or give you back what you lost. But I needed you to know that your sacrifice was not invisible, was not forgotten, was not meaningless. You changed the world when you talked to a scared 16-year-old girl in a clinic waiting room. You changed my world. You gave me life. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift." Diane couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was hearing. $7 million in foundations and scholarships, her apartment paid for, a trust fund, a job offer, financial security for the first time in nearly 3 decades. And more than that, more than all the money, was the recognition, was hearing her story told, was being seen and valued and thanked, was knowing that her choice had mattered, that her sacrifice had created something beautiful, that the hard years had not been for nothing. She finally found her voice, and it was shaky but strong, and she said, "I didn't do it for recognition or reward. I did it because it was right. Because when I looked at that frightened girl, I saw someone who needed hope. And when I thought about the life inside her, I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't let that life end without at least trying to offer another option. And I knew there would be consequences. I knew powerful people don't like being challenged. But some things are more important than career or money or comfort. Some things are worth sacrificing for. And life, precious innocent life, is one of those things." Her words rang through the ballroom with moral clarity that made several people shift uncomfortably, because many of the guests in that room had made different choices, had prioritized convenience over conviction, had stayed silent when they should have spoken up, had protected their own interests rather than standing up for what was right. And Diane's simple statement of principle was a mirror that showed them who they were and who they could have been. Christopher nodded, understanding what she was saying, and he replied, "I know you didn't do it for reward. That's exactly why you deserve to be rewarded, because the purest acts are the ones done without expectation of return. And you gave everything and expected nothing. And that makes you a hero, and heroes should be celebrated, should be honored, should be lifted up as examples of what human beings can be when we choose compassion over convenience." The rest of the reception was transformed. What had begun as a typical society wedding became something else entirely, became a celebration not just of Christopher and Victoria's marriage, but of Diane's sacrifice, and the value of choosing life, and the power of one person's courage to change the future. Table 17 was no longer isolated in the corner. It became the center of everything. Guests pulled chairs over to sit with Diane, to hear her story in her own words, to tell her how moved they were, to ask her questions about her life and her work and her hopes for the future. The wedding planner, mortified by how Diane had been treated earlier, personally apologized and moved her to a place of honor at a front table. And the catering staff brought her special desserts and made sure her champagne glass was always full. And the band dedicated a song to her. And Christopher and Victoria made sure to spend significant time sitting with her, introducing her to family and friends, making it clear that she was not just a guest but a treasured part of their story. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Diane found herself talking with Christopher's adoptive mother, Catherine Hamilton, an elegant woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. And Catherine took Diane's hands and said, "I need to thank you, not just for my son's life, but for the gift of being his mother. I was told for years that I couldn't have children, and it broke my heart. And when the adoption agency called and said there was a baby boy who needed a home, it was the happiest day of my life, and every moment with Christopher has been a blessing. Every scraped knee and school play and graduation, and now this wedding, all of it has been the greatest joy of my existence. And none of it would have happened without you, without your courage to speak up and your willingness to pay the price for doing so. You gave me Why, son, you gave me the chance to be a mother, and I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life." The two women embraced, both crying, and Diane felt something healing in her heart, some wound that had been open for 28 years finally beginning to close, because she had always wondered if her choice mattered, had always questioned whether destroying her own life to save someone else's was worth it, had spent countless lonely nights wondering if that scared 16-year-old girl had just ended up getting an abortion somewhere else, wondering if Christopher had ended up in a loving home or had suffered in the foster system, wondering if her sacrifice had produced anything good or if it had all been for nothing. Now she knew. Now she could see with her own eyes the beautiful young man who existed because she had spoken up, the loving parents who had raised him, the bright future stretching ahead of him. And it was worth it, all of it. Every hard year and every lonely night and every moment of struggle was worth it because life was worth it. Because Christopher's life was valuable and meaningful and full of potential, and she had been part of making that possible. Later in the evening, when the dancing had begun and couples swirled across the floor to a live orchestra, Christopher approached Diane and extended his hand and asked if she would dance with him. And she laughed and said she didn't really know how to dance, that she'd never been to events like this, but he insisted. And he led her onto the dance floor, and the crowd parted for them, and they danced to What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. And Christopher held her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was family. And he said quietly so only she could hear, "I want you in my life going forward, not as an obligation or a token gesture, but as real family. I want you at Sunday dinners and holidays and birthday parties. I want you to know my children when I have them. I want them to call you Grandma Diane, and to hear stories about your courage. I want you woven into the fabric of my life because that's where you belong. And I know we can't get back the years we lost. The years when you should have been able to watch me grow up and know that your sacrifice produced something beautiful. But we have now. We have the future, and I don't want to waste it." Diane nodded against his shoulder, too emotional to speak, and when the song ended and they walked off the dance floor, she saw that every person in that ballroom was watching them with tears in their eyes, and she realized that this story, her story, had touched something deep in these people, had reminded them of what really matters, had challenged them to think about their own choices and priorities, and whether they were living with the same kind of courage and conviction that she had shown. The drunk groomsman who had questioned her presence earlier approached her hesitantly and apologized with genuine remorse, admitting that he had made assumptions based on her appearance, that he had been wrong and ignorant, and he was ashamed. And Diane accepted his apology with grace and told him that everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them. And he walked away looking like he had been given a gift he didn't deserve. As midnight approached and the reception began to wind down, Victoria pulled Diane aside and showed her something on her phone, news articles that were already being written about the wedding, because several guests had shared the story on social media, and it was going viral. The hashtag Diane Forster was trending. Videos of Christopher's speech were being shared thousands of times. And people across the country were being moved by this story of sacrifice and redemption, and the value of choosing life, even at great personal cost. Victoria said, "You're going to be famous. People are going to want to interview you and hear your story and learn from you. And I know that might feel overwhelming, but please consider sharing your message. Because the world needs to hear it, needs to be reminded that individual choices matter, that courage matters, that standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything is still the right thing to do. And you embody all of that. You are a living example of principled conviction. And your voice could change countless lives." Diane looked at the articles and the comments from strangers praising her and being inspired by her, and she felt simultaneously humbled and empowered, because she had lived her life in obscurity, had assumed her story would die with her, had never imagined that her choice made in a clinic waiting room 28 years ago would ever be known by anyone beyond the few people directly involved. And now here it was, spreading across the internet, touching hearts, changing minds, inspiring people to reconsider their own assumptions about sacrifice and value, and what kind of life is worth fighting for. She thought about the foundation Christopher had created in her name, about the nursing students who would graduate debt-free because of her story, about the healthcare workers who would be protected from retaliation because someone finally stood up and said that what happened to Diane Foster was wrong and should never happen again. And she realized that her sacrifice had been multiplied, had been leveraged into something far bigger than she ever imagined, had become a legacy that would outlive her and help people she would never meet. When the reception finally ended and guests began to leave, dozens of people stopped by to hug Diane or shake her hand or tell her one more time how moved they were by her story. And the woman in diamonds who had laughed at her earlier approached with red eyes and genuine contrition and said, "I judged you the moment I saw you. I looked at your dress and your hair, and I decided you didn't belong here. And I am so ashamed of myself, because you belong here more than anyone. You are the reason this celebration exists, and I will never forget this lesson. Will never again assume that I know someone's worth based on their appearance. Thank you for teaching me something essential about character and value. Thank you for being exactly who you are." Diane hugged this woman whose name she didn't even know, and she whispered that forgiveness was possible, that growth was possible, that we're all on a journey toward becoming better versions of ourselves. Christopher and Victoria insisted on having their driver take Diane home, and as she rode through the Atlanta streets in the back of a luxury town car, she looked out at the city lights and reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had just taken, how she had walked into that ballroom feeling invisible and unwelcome, and had walked out feeling seen and valued and celebrated. How in the span of a few hours her entire financial situation had been transformed. How she had gone from struggling to survive to having security and options and a future that felt bright for the first time in decades. But more than the money, more than the foundation or the trust fund or the job offer, what meant the most was the recognition, was hearing Christopher tell her story to a room full of people and watching their perception shift, was seeing in their eyes that they understood what she had given up and why it mattered, was knowing that her choice, her sacrifice, her courage had been named and honored and would be remembered. When she got home to her small apartment, which apparently now belonged to her free and clear, she sat on her worn couch and opened the locket around her neck, the locket she had touched so many times during the reception, and she looked at the tiny photograph inside, a newspaper clipping from 28 years ago showing a brief birth announcement. Baby boy born to undisclosed parents, placed for private adoption. The only proof she had ever had that the pregnancy she tried to save had actually resulted in a birth, that the life she fought for had actually survived. She had cut that announcement from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and kept it all these years, had looked at it whenever she doubted whether her sacrifice had been worth it, and now she could add to that locket a photo from tonight, a photo Victoria had taken of Diane and Christopher dancing, of them smiling at each other like the family they were now going to become. And it was tangible evidence that her faith had been rewarded, that her courage had mattered, that the lonely, difficult years had produced something beautiful. Over the following weeks and months, Diane's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. The story of her sacrifice at Christopher's wedding went national. She was interviewed by major news outlets, was invited to speak at churches and universities and conferences, became an advocate for life and for protecting whistleblowers, and for standing up for conscience even in the face of powerful opposition. The Diane Foster Foundation grew beyond its initial $5 million endowment as donors across the country contributed to support healthcare workers who faced retaliation for putting patients first, and dozens of workers came forward with their own stories of being punished for doing the right thing, and the foundation provided legal support and financial assistance and advocacy. And it became a powerful force for changing how healthcare institutions treated employees who raised ethical concerns. The scholarship fund at Emory sent its first class of nursing students through school, and they graduated wearing special pins that identified them as Diane Foster Scholars. And at the ceremony, Diane spoke to them about the responsibility that comes with the privilege of caring for others, about choosing courage over convenience, about remembering that every patient is a person with inherent worth and dignity. Diane accepted the position in patient advocacy at Emory Hospital, and she brought to that work a depth of compassion and understanding that came from her own experience of being marginalized and dismissed, and she became a powerful voice for vulnerable patients, especially patients of color and low-income patients who often felt invisible in the healthcare system. And she used her platform to advocate for changes in how hospitals treated patients and staff. And her influence grew until she was appointed to the hospital's board of directors, the first former home health aide to ever serve in such a position, and she wore that honor with humility and purpose. She also became deeply involved in Christopher and Victoria's life. True to his promise, he included her in family gatherings and holidays, and when they had their first child 2 years after the wedding, a beautiful baby girl, they named her Diane Catherine Hamilton, and they asked Diane Foster to be her godmother. And when Diane held that baby for the first time, she wept with joy because this was her legacy. This was the future she had made possible. This was proof that choosing life creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or imagine. The relationship with Christopher's biological mother also developed in unexpected ways. The woman reached out to Diane through Christopher, wanting to meet the person who had saved her baby, and they met for coffee at a quiet cafe in Buckhead. And it was awkward at first because what do you say to someone who changed your life when you were 16 and scared and didn't know any better? But they talked for hours, and the biological mother, whose name was Jennifer, apologized for what her parents had done to Diane, apologized for not being strong enough to stop them, apologized for the years of suffering Diane had endured because she tried to help. And Diane told her that she understood that 16-year-olds shouldn't have to fight their parents' power alone, that she didn't blame Jennifer for what happened, and that seeing Christopher's life, seeing the man he became, was all the vindication she needed. They became friends, these two women whose lives had intersected for 20 minutes in a clinic waiting room, and had been forever changed by that intersection. And they worked together on the foundation, using their combined story to advocate for better support for young women facing unplanned pregnancies, for more options and less judgment, for recognition that these are complex situations requiring compassion rather than condemnation. 5 years after the wedding, at a gala celebrating the Diane Foster Foundation's work, Christopher stood at a podium in front of 500 supporters and donors and told them that the foundation had now helped over 300 healthcare workers who faced retaliation for ethical stands, had sent 200 students through nursing school debt-free, and had successfully lobbied for state legislation protecting healthcare whistleblowers. And all of this had started because one woman chose courage over career 28 years ago in a moment when no one was watching, and no one would have known if she had stayed silent. He introduced Diane, who took the stage to thunderous applause, and she spoke about how her life had been transformed not just by Christopher's generosity, but by the reminder that our choices matter, that individual acts of courage can change the world, that we never know how far the ripples of our decisions will spread, and that the hardest right choices often produce the most beautiful results, even if we don't see them immediately. 28 years ago, I was 23 years old and working my way through nursing school, and I had dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse and maybe someday starting my own family. And in one 20-minute conversation, I made a choice that cost me all of those dreams, that destroyed the future I had planned, that sent my life into a spiral of struggle and loneliness that lasted for decades. And there were many times when I regretted that choice, many nights when I wondered if speaking up had been worth it. Many moments when I was angry at God or fate or myself for the trajectory my life had taken. But I can stand here tonight and tell you with absolute certainty that it was worth it. Every hard year, every lonely night, every financial struggle, all of it was worth it because a life was saved, because Christopher exists, because he married Victoria and had children and built a career helping others, and created this foundation that's now helping hundreds of people. And none of that would exist if I had stayed silent that day. She paused, her voice thick with emotion, and continued. But more than that, more than just the specific good that came from my choice, what I learned is that we don't always get to see the results of our courage. We don't always get the happy ending where the person we helped comes back and thanks us and changes our circumstances. Most of the time, when we do the right thing at great personal cost, we simply pay the cost and move on and never know if it mattered. And we have to be okay with that. We have to choose courage anyway. We have to do what's right even when it's hard, and even when no one will ever know, and even when we get no reward. Because that's what character is. That's what integrity is. That's what it means to be fully human. And I want everyone watching this to understand that your choices matter. Your courage matters. Your willingness to speak up for what's right even when it costs you everything. That matters. And you may never get a foundation named after you or a wedding speech or any recognition at all. But you will have the satisfaction of knowing that you lived according to your principles, that you valued life and dignity and truth more than comfort or career or convenience. And that is a reward no one can take from you. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes, and Diane stood at that podium looking out at 500 people who were inspired by her story. And she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, thought about the scared 23-year-old nurse who had seen a crying teenager and decided to stop and talk, thought about the hard years that followed when she wondered if anyone cared about her sacrifice, thought about the invitation to Christopher's wedding that had arrived like a message from heaven saying your pain was not meaningless, and thought about the beautiful life she now lived, a life filled with purpose and connection, and the knowledge that she had mattered, that she had made a difference, that she had chosen correctly even when the cost was almost more than she could bear. Today, Diane Foster is 61 years old. She retired from her position at Emory Hospital last year, but remains deeply involved with the foundation and the scholarship program. She has spoken at over 200 events sharing her story and encouraging others to choose courage. And she has become a grandmother figure to Christopher and Victoria's 3 children who adore her and call her Grandma Diane and ask her to tell them the story of how she saved their daddy's life. She lives in a beautiful townhouse that Christopher helped her purchase in a safe neighborhood, and she has financial security for the first time in her adult life, and she has friends and family and purpose. But when people ask her what she's most proud of, she doesn't mention the foundation or the speaking engagements, or the legislation, or any of the recognition she's received. She talks about that 20-minute conversation in a clinic waiting room, about looking into a 16-year-old girl's eyes and seeing fear and offering hope, about trusting her instincts that life was precious even when powerful people disagreed, about paying an enormous price for a principle that she couldn't compromise, and about learning that the most important moments of our lives are often the ones where we choose character over convenience, where we stand up for what's right even when we stand alone, where we sacrifice our own comfort to protect someone else's future. And those moments define us, shape us, echo through time in ways we can't predict or control. The story of the black woman who sat alone at the wedding in a simple navy dress and became the most honored guest in the ballroom is now told in churches and schools and advocacy organizations across the country. It's a story about courage and sacrifice, and the power of one voice to change the course of a life. It's a story about how wrong assumptions can be, and how important it is to look beyond surface appearances to see the character underneath. It's a story about the value of every human life and the ripple effects of our choices. And most of all, it's a story about redemption, about how years of suffering can be transformed into purpose, about how sacrifices made in obscurity can eventually be brought into the light, about how the hero sitting alone in the corner in the cheap dress can turn out to be the most important person in the room, and about how love and courage and the refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice can create legacies that outlive us and change the world in ways we never imagined. And every time that story is told, people are reminded that they too have choices to make, that they too will face moments where doing the right thing costs them something precious, that they too will have to decide whether their principles are worth sacrificing for. And the story of Diane Foster whispers to them across the years. Choose courage, choose life, choose to speak up even when you're afraid, because you never know whose future you're saving. You never know what beautiful things will grow from the seeds of your sacrifice. And even if you never see the results, even if you sit alone in the corner for 28 years before anyone acts, knowledge is what you gave up. The choice to do right is always worth making, always matters, and always defines who you truly are when everything else is stripped away.